Welcome everybody to the University of Applied Research and Development's Emergency Response and Risk Management podcast. I'm here with Jay O'Connor, who is an Emergency Preparedness Program Manager for the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory. So I'm delighted to have you here, Jay.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thanks for making this happen on your day off.
No problem.
Hey, so Jay, tell us about your role and what you do right now.
Okay, well, my current role for the Canadian Nuclear Lab's White Shell location in Manitoba, Canada, is to, like many emergency response roles, I'm the what if guy. So it's my job to consider the what if this were to occur and what if that were to occur. Then we take a look at what can we do to mitigation, prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, right? So make sure we're prepared for each of those. And an interesting thing that the nuclear industry does that was sort of new for me when I came into the nuclear industry, is they have a principle known as ALARA, which is as low as reasonably achievable, which is something they apply to radiological protection and controlling the spread of contamination and stuff like that. Very similar to COVID, it's an invisible opponent, if you will. And so lots of checks and balances put into place, but at the end of the day, there's an understanding that you can only do what is reasonable. And so it's been interesting to take that and apply it to the emergency response work that we do as far as our emergency procedures, the teams and response teams that we put together. And in this particular role, I get to do a lot more hands-on exercise development and training and running exercise drills for the security, fire, medical response teams on site, as well as the facility operators and things like that. So it's been a very interesting job because I get everything from the high-level policy stuff all the way down to running boots on the ground drills in the field, which takes me back to my roots a little bit, which has been very interesting.
So tell us about a usual week in Jay's emergency preparedness and response.
All right. Well, as you can imagine, the nuclear industry, like many others, like oil and gas and stuff, is very highly regulated. So big part of my job is making sure that we stay compliant both with our regulatory and licensing requirements, but also with what works for the site. So I've got to take those rules, make sure we check all those boxes appropriately and are prepared and ready for those things, but then take a hard look at the site to see what else could occur here that's maybe not covered through regulation. There can be a tendency to get a little bit tunnel vision and just focus in on what the regulator mandates and dictates and stuff, as opposed to taking a look at the bigger picture. So a normal week for me is usually do a lot of exercises and drills. I spend a lot of time at the beginning of the year making sure all of my procedures and documents are done and up to speed, so that for the rest of the year I can focus on implementation and tweaking and adapting those procedures over the course of the year, and then do a bit of a reset at the end of the year and start that cycle again. So this time of year, I would have just normally, if it wasn't for COVID currently, I would have just normally finished all of my procedural reviews, and I would be working on training with the various teams that I have. So we have our first responders that I work closely with. We have our emergency operations center staff, so the strategic people that set up and run things. And then I have an in-between group, which we call the Officer in Charge and Emergency Steward program. So each building on site that has occupants in it has an officer in charge. So some places call it a fire marshal, fire warden program, those sorts of things, same idea. But the idea is that when an emergency happens, I need each building essentially to be a standalone, prepared to respond and understand their role, and then how that fits into the bigger picture and the overall response on site. So it's a lot of kind of coordinating those moving parts and ensuring that one change to one facility or team doesn't have a trickle-down effect to the rest of the site, and making sure that there's sort of that harmonious interchange between the different groups and the levels of response. So,
is there a method or a model that you use, like ICS or something, to run things and train people?
Yeah, I'm a very firm believer in the incident command system. In Canada, at least on the prairies, ICS in Western Canada has been prevalent for a number of years. It's the premier response system that's used out here. Interesting thing is with bigger companies like the Canadian Nuclear Labs, we have sites here and in Ontario and Quebec and New Brunswick, so several different provinces. And in Eastern Canada, they use a slightly different or adapted version of ICS. So it's always interesting to strike that balance between ensuring that corporately we're kind of following the corporate line and meeting the mandate there set forth by the head office, but at the same time ensuring that we're able to plug in with the local response group. So no fire department that I've ever come across or worked for ever has more staff than they need for normal operations, which means they're very quickly overwhelmed during disasters and major emergency events. Same thing with police and EMS. So we can handle the day-to-day events on site, but if something bigger were to occur, we obviously would have to rely upon our local response fire department's medical system in the region where we operate. So ensuring that we speak a common language with them, which is one of the fundamental points of ICS, making sure that we can integrate with them, but we can still talk with the head office and make sure that lines up.
How do you cultivate those relationships?
So in this job, it's been a little different for me. Normally in my sort of past life, there was a lot more interactions. I almost want to say social interactions, getting together for lunch and, having those conversations, getting to know the individuals. It's been a little bit different here because as a nuclear site, we're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants, no city wants a nuclear site in their backyard, right? So we're rather isolated, but we try and invite them out. We do annual exercises. I try and maintain relationships with my counterparts within those organizations. Again, there's an expression in Canada in emergency management, which is you don't want to be exchanging business cards at the time of an emergency, right? That's the wrong time to be doing that. So just making sure that the guy on the other end of the phone or the gal on the other end of the phone, when I pick it up and say, hey, this is Jay, I need this, make sure that they know who I am, understand we have that relationship established, that I know resources will start moving quickly and we'll work out the details sort of farther down the road when we get there. But there won't be a delay in that response. So there's been a little bit of that. But again, with this role being a little more tactical and tied to the boots on the ground, we've actually had the opportunity to bring offsite fire departments in, run joint drills with them, joint drills with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is the federal police department of jurisdiction. And then with our local regional health authority, bringing them in and running different drills. It provides a sort of wealth of opportunity to get people in to play together. And for them, it's interesting because nuclear is not something very common in Canada, especially in the area where we are. We're the only nuclear site in Western Canada, really. Everything else is typically focused in Ontario. So for the responders out here, this is not something they come across very often.
Right.
Part of what I do is making sure when I run an exercise that we get what we need out of it, which is that, medical interaction or fire interaction, but that they also get some sort of a greater understanding of the hazards that they're going to face if they do come to the site and what we are going to do to protect them from those potential hazards. So it gives them that peace of mind.
And that's annually, or do you do other smaller communications and meetings?
So the big field level exercises or functional exercises, those are usually annually, at least for the fire department, because it's a much bigger group to try and organize that. So we try and do something annually with them. And then with our health authority, I run multiple health or medical type scenarios on our site. And so kind of open it up to them and say, if you've got a day when they're available and you want to send them in, we can easily integrate them into that response. So we'll usually get a couple or three of those in a year with those smaller level responses. And an interesting opportunity that we have on our site that's, I guess, somewhat unique is we're a decommissioning site. So our job right now is to actually shut down the site, tear down all the buildings, work ourselves out of jobs. But because of that, I do a lot of work with the RCMP emergency response team and their bomb disposal team and groups like that, because it's an opportunity for them to come and play with a building that we're going to knock down in a week's time anyways, and so they can blow holes in walls and do some of the stuff with a heavy commercial building that they wouldn't normally get the opportunity to practice. They just look at the theory. Most of what they get is residential type wood frame structures. So to have a big concrete building they can play around with prevents some good training opportunities for them, and certainly goes a long way to strengthen those relationships for us from a response perspective.
Normally blowing up someone else's building does not form a relationship. That sounds unique.
It's a bit of fun too, I will admit. So
yeah. Hey, tell us about some of your previous roles that you've had and the experiences that you've had where you've learned things from.
All right. I've actually had some really interesting opportunities. My previous job prior to this, I was the emergency manager for the city of Regina, which is the capital city of Saskatchewan, one of the provinces here. And so that was a very interesting role for me. That's the municipal level government. And it's really, I always described it as the center of the hourglass. So from there, you would go up to the provincial, the government, or regional for some countries, and then you have your federal level government above that. Those things always feed down to the municipal level. And then from the municipal level, spreading out, working with all of your critical infrastructure sector partners and stuff like that. So all of them were looking to you for guidance, direction, leadership, because you were the authority having jurisdiction, and all of the feds were trying to feed information into you. But when it really came down to it, the federal government's ability to roll out a lot of or to mandate and have work accomplished requires the municipal government, the people with the buses, the firefighters, and those sorts of people. We needed that relationship. So it was a really fascinating position to be in the middle of that for a city like Regina. And prior to coming to Regina, I actually did a similar role, but with small rural communities. So I would have a community of 500 people or 1,200 people. And that was I was hired into that role right out of university. And so I took everything I'd learned about ICS and all the stuff I learned in university, and I had to apply it to an environment where there was no resources. Small communities get volunteered out very quickly. So the people that are willing to volunteer to do stuff are usually already on 3 or 4 different groups. So that municipal thing or that rural municipal thing was an excellent learning opportunity, because it forced me to take a look at what I had learned and then figure out not just the letter of the law, if you will, but what's the intent and how do I apply that where I only have 12 people to do all of the work that in the city of Regina I might have 500 people to do. So it was a very fascinating progression. So to start there kind of forced me to take a look at what I had learned and apply it and find that intent, I guess. And that kind of shaped how I handled emergency response from that point forward in my career. And then moving into the Regina, suddenly I was back into that environment where the resources were available. So I could sort of branch out and increase scope there a little bit. And now moving into where I am now in an industrial environment. Again, it's a very different concept because it's less about public protection. Not that we don't stress public safety, but it's that corporate level mandate. You're not interacting with the public on a regular basis. And so it's a very different perspective. It's very inward focused, whereas in those municipal roles, it was very outward focused. So, and I guess prior to that, just university, I have the honor or the distinction of being the first person to enroll in a full-time emergency management program in Canada. Wow. It was the first program put forward, and I was like I say, first person to find out about it, put my name in the hat for it, and kind of to see that grow as an industry in Canada and to have been a part of that pilot process. And now there's several other programs, and it's been a very interesting journey.
What motivated you to enroll in that?
Well, I started before all of that I lived in British Columbia, and I was involved with search and rescue. Kind of my passion. I loved the outdoors and off-roading and hiking and all those fun outdoor activities. And so it seemed to lend itself with my personality to wanting to help people out to the search and rescue field. Met some great guys, had some interesting opportunities, and I was trying to find a way of making that a full-time career. And I was actually just about to sign up for a structural engineering course because I did a lot of collapsed structural rescue because of the earthquake threat that's in BC. And I found about this program and I thought, that sounds perfect. And so kind of followed it, and it's led me on this path, this journey ever since.
So from search and rescue to the Bachelor program to working in a city environment to then in an industrial environment, that's quite a few changes that you've been through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What would be one of the most, I don't want to say scary, but invigorating activities, either a simulation or a real event that you've been involved in?
Well, one of the interesting things with the city of Regina is that every major pipeline in Canada, oil and gas pipeline in Canada, runs either through the city of Regina or within a couple of miles of the city of Regina. So it just geographically, the way it's located with all the oil fields, everything from Alberta flows that direction, everything heading down to the States passes through there, everything going east goes off. So we had storage cabins, we had a refinery complex, we had large oil storage facilities in the city, and all of these pipelines. So it created some very interesting training opportunities. And the refinery complex in the city it was very well run, a very good group to work with. But no organization is free from hiccups or bumps along the road. And so there was an incident there at one point where there was a leak in one of the processes or whatever, and they'd had a small explosion and a fire, and they were dealing with that on site. So our job to set up, and it was very interesting because sort of stuck in that not knowing what was going on and looking for that information. I got actually notified by the EMS guy they were heading off to respond to it. And he phoned me and said, "Hey, do you know what happened?" And I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "Oh, there was an explosion at the refinery complex." And when you know it, at that point in time, his cell phone dropped the call. And I'm sitting there going, what? So was able to get some information pretty quickly. But that was very interesting because that's one of those situations where, you've done a lot of looking at it and prepping for it and plans and procedures. But there's a lot of moving parts with something like that. And in the end, it turned out to be a fairly minor event, and it wasn't, there was no off-site or off the refinery site consequences to deal with. But that was a very interesting opportunity and a bit of an eye-opener, if you will, right. as to what this industry is really all about, like what it boils down to, and why that information is important, and why those processes to get the information and have it moving and flowing quickly and freely is just so vital to what we do. So,
because you've moved through different environments in your career thus far, many of our students, they're from the oil and gas industry. They've studied and learned and been awarded industry training standards in safety and emergency response, and they've done that for many years and held their own positions, plus carried the emergency response and safety positions as well. And maybe they're thinking about where to from here. And also we may have people that are new graduates coming through the program. So what's some career advice or some wisdom that you could share?
Well, the one thing I really like about emergency management is it's a very focused field, but it's very diverse in nature. There's so many different ways you can take this to suit your own personal strengths and interests, which is fascinating. So I always try and encourage people that are wanting to get into this to, one, try and get some response experience. So whether that's through a volunteer fire department, or whether that's through an organization like the Red Cross or something like that, where you get out to see the emergency from the ground level, from that public response level looking up. That's had a huge impact on my ability to effectively communicate with those groups, but also to plan for and work with those groups. So definitely encourage people to try and find some way to get that response experience if you can. And yeah, you know what? Like I say, as you go through the industry, you start to find those things that you become very interested in. There's a lot of sister close occupations. So the occupational health and safety industry, for example, I kind of consider that micro level emergency management. And emergency management's kind of the macro level occupational health and safety when you really kind of boil it down, right? So working very close with those folks has been interesting. And again, so that's almost a range where you can figure out where along that spectrum you're interested in being. Do you want to be at the very top and pushing directives down from, say, a head office perspective and pushing it out to different sites? Do you want to be on the guy on the site that takes that information and has to apply it and make it work and function? So yeah, I mean, obviously everybody needs a job. We got to find something, but I think the best thing to do is once you get that experience, start looking at which of those things really tickles your fancy or interests you the most, and then pursue that aspect. Like I say, it's an amazing industry where you get to stay very, very focused on what you do, but really over a broad spectrum of opportunities. Yeah, the biggest thing for me has been to encourage people to try and find some way to get a little bit of experience being somebody working under that emergency management umbrella. So being that response level and seeing it from underneath, seeing what that looks like when that information's pushed down, because that has such a big impact on how we package our information when it's our job to push that information down or push that out to a community or an organization. So.
Well, Jay, I really want to thank you for your time, for sharing what you're doing now and the experiences that you've had and advice for people moving through the industry and their training right now. Thank you so much for making this happen today for us.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks. You too.